Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? Well, yesterday I made this video entitled something like Information Density and Dice. And it was the beginning of a video response to Ron Edwards and Ben from the Questing Beast channel. And they had this really cool conversation about dice, which really piqued my interest and got me thinking about something, and specifically dice and information density. When we invoke the mechanic, however the game actually works, we roll the bones, we take a look at all these pieces of plastic that have hit the table. It's going to give us somewhere on the spectrum a lesser or greater amount of information density. And this density of information serves as prompts for us to spark our creativity, to prompt us to shape the fiction, to narrate. So in a very real way, these dice interact with the fiction through us. And the amount of information they give us, well, that can very often spark and jumpstart our creativity. And whether that's in the moment or just a wide spectrum of possible results, which can give us all kinds of gradations or prompts along the spectrum to, once again, give us inspiration for what we say happens in the fiction, well, that can be great. But I want to talk about the flip side today, and that's where we start to run into diminishing returns, where either the continued amount of information available on the spectrum or in the moment doesn't really yield us anything else, and also where it starts to be too much of a good thing, where it actually starts to stifle creativity. And some of this is based on bias and preference, and some of this is based upon just psychology and how humans are able to conceptualize of things like gradations on a spectrum of success or failure or competence or just difference. And we tend to overestimate our ability to be able to tell the difference between various points on a spectrum, when realistically, 3 standard deviations, and I know I'm going to use the term wrong a couple times here, but bear with me. The idea we can estimate, something dead center, slightly good, slightly bad, a little bit better or worse than that, and then like abysmally, abysmal failure. You fumbled tying your shoes, how could you? Or an amazing critical success. So there's a few different ways this can show up. The first way that too much information can kind of stifle creativity or stifle narration is quite literally, we've got too much information. And it varies from group to group. This is kind of bias and preference based. But we feel like we're backed into a corner. Like quite literally, however the dice mechanics actually work, they've given us so many details about the resolution or the outcome that it doesn't really let us narrate very much. And your ninja has jumped into the middle of all their enemies, and it's telling us that their feet have landed exactly 1/2 meter apart, and they're facing slightly east, and they're in a 45-degree crouch, and their enemies have been stunned for 2 rounds, and blah blah blah. I'm making all this stuff up. I have no idea if there's a game that actually does that, but we've all had that moment where geez, what is there left for me to do? I feel like the charts and the dice are actually playing the game for me. And once again, this can vary from person to person and group to group. But we've found ourselves having stifled creativity because we feel like we have too much information being given us by the dice. The information density is too great. Another way that too much information can end up stifling creativity is not so much that it's too prescriptive, but we have so many data points, so many things that are supposed to be prompting us, so many things that we need to pay attention to as a result of this die roll, whatever they happen to be, that we end up with information overload. Once again, this is kind of bias and preference and varies from person to person and group to group, but we don't know where to start, where it stifles our creativity because there's too many flashing lights going on and we don't know what to do. That's where we start to run to diminishing returns or too much information in the moment. Too much of a good thing. But what about, instead of the density of the data points on the table once the dice have stopped rolling, what about the actual spectrum? And I started to talk about that a little bit in terms of the ability of human beings to reliably discern between gradations or differences upon a spectrum. And we are only so good at it. But when we're presented with a wide range of numbers, we still want to assign meaning to them, and this can cause problems. Sometimes there's just too many of them. But what am I talking about? Well, we could, talk about what I was talking about in the first video, and that's what I'm going to talk about. The difference between something like roll and total, which gives us a whole bunch of data points, the greatest amount of information density on the spectrum. We're rolling maybe a d20, maybe we're rolling percentile dice, maybe we're rolling 6d6. But this is giving us our spectra of information, as opposed to doing something like a roll and sort, where maybe we're still rolling 6 dice, but we're treating them like ubiquity dice, where they're success or failure. They're essentially D2s. We're doing coin flips, and something like that. Well, that'll give us this curve of 3 standard deviations. Whether it actually models 3 standard deviations, that's unimportant. The idea that the results will tend to, the most likely result is going to be dead center, and then 1 degree of success or failure beyond that is going to be very likely as well. After that, it drops off kind of precipitously, where 2, like a very good success or a very bad failure, not terribly likely. And finally, the abysmal, the fumble or the critical, they're highly unlikely, but they do show up from time to time. And this video isn't really about those curves and which curve is better and how steep you want. That's an entirely different conversation. It's more about that number, or those number of data points that you actually end up with. So we can conceptualize pretty well something like 7, and very often we don't even do that. And I'll talk about the D20 just a little bit, but I want to save that for another video. But let's say instead of rolling our 6D, 66 and just calling them 6D ubiquity or 6D2, we're going to roll 66 and total them up. So now we're looking at this 6 to 36 spectrum, and maybe it's we're trying to do a thing. What the thing is really isn't really important. It's what actually happens with all these extra data points. Our median on that is going to be 21, and forgive me, I'm going to get this a little bit off. So if you're a real math whiz, you can take a look at this and correct me. But it's not intuitive. But in terms of probability, by the time we get to about 24 or 25, that's where our first standard deviation lives. Already, that's a great success. By the time we get to something like 28, that is our really super success. That's like our 2 standard deviations above normal. By the time we get to something like 29 or 30, that's 3 standard deviations. The difference statistically between getting a 30 and a 36 is infinitesimal. They're all very, very unlikely to actually happen. But the die roll is giving us all these information points. And what we tend to want to do psychologically is assign some kind of difference between 30 and 36 when it shows up. Maybe the game even tells us there is some difference between that. But realistically, in terms of actual probability, there really isn't. And so we're stuck trying to make sense of this wide range of data points, which really, in terms of like how likely are they to actually come up, there's not a big difference. So we're being given too much information in a very real way by using something like roll in total to do this, because we don't need 30 data points or 31 data points, whatever it happens to be. Something like 7, that's good enough to model actual probabilities and things that we can actually hold in our head and are able to narrate the difference between. It's impossible for us to really narrate 36 different or 31 different degrees of success or failure. Sure, if it's a fireball and we're doing our 66 fireball, yes, that's a damage, and that does mean something. But for the most part, if we're trying to use it to model success at a task, whatever that happens to be, we want to do the thing, that's way too many data points. Interestingly, one of the other things that we tend to do, where sometimes we can argue there are too many data points or we're paying too much attention to the data points that show up on the die, we'll take a look at something like the D20. And, quite literally, that die is, in most games, like D20 games or like, say, OSR games, it's really a die that's supposed to model success or failure. Did you do the thing or not? Now, psychologically, I know what happens. It just happened in the game I played when we play Lamentations of the Flame Princess and we're playing Lamentations of the Martian Princess. If somebody has a target number of 16 to do a thing and they roll a 16, hooray, they've done it. And then he'll breathe a sigh of relief, or they give the old touchdown sign or whatever. If we roll like a 19 or 20, everybody gets very excited. Does it really mean anything different? No, but it's just a really high number at that point, and people are like, hooray, that's great. If you roll a 15, there's that kind of like, man, you just missed. We're assigning some degree of failure at that point. And if the person rolls a 4 or 3, there's that real crestfallen look on their face. Now, in terms of the game mechanics, the way the game works, is there any real difference between rolling that 3 and rolling that 15? No, they're both failures at that point. But we are kind of assigning some kind of meaning. There's nothing wrong with that. That can be part of the real rules of your gaming table. But if you look at that spectrum I just talked about, we're talking about like 4 data points. Really bad, a fumble, like just a really bad failure. I just almost got it. Success, and woohoo, I rolled a 20. That's great. 4 data points. it's easy for us to conceive of something like that. You know, trying to conceive of something more, and you know, I've played with people that want to assign more difference narratively to like a 17 or an 18 or a 19, or is there a big difference between a 3 and a 7 and a 10? And you know, way too many data points at that point, and we're taking them way too seriously. So those are some of the ways that, you know, we can start to experience diminishing returns. And it's, in a very real sense, most of it is based on psychology. Either we get backed into a corner where we can't narrate and stifles our creativity, we get too overwhelmed by so many data points, or there are so many degrees of success or failure. Either really the system says there are, or very often the system really doesn't say that. Our brains are just trying to assign meaning to this wide spectrum of numbers, when really there isn't that much difference between them in terms of what do they really mean based on the game mechanics, and what do they really mean in the fiction, and you know how and what actually happens in terms of probability. Talk to you later, kids, and we'll talk about the lonely D20 next.